So beginning off here, I wanted to start talking about the NetSuite process for manufacturing, really focus in on that specific vertical, because NetSuite has a lot of features when it comes to manufacturing across order to cash, procure to pay, accounting, work orders and assemblies, WIP and routing. What does it look like connecting with lots of different vendors? And really, that's really how I'm going to focus the rest of this conversation for that specific audience. So if you are someone involved in any one of those departments or flows, then we'll cover them from a high level to get you a little bit more educated on what NetSuite is capable of doing. And I think I kind of want to go into, as this conversation progresses, I want to go into a little bit about how to customize ERP environments specifically for manufacturing, because there's a number of things that in the manufacturing industry that they need to have tailored for their use case and automate a bit more. And I'll speak to that during the process too, when it comes to engineering and working with CAD files and generating those bombs. I'll speak to that too.
Caleb, so as we kick things off here, where do you think, out of all those different parts of an ERP that you just listed off, where do you think it is the most important part for a manufacturing company to really focus on as they start to investigate the process of maybe acquiring NetSuite as their ERP of choice?
Well, it's going to be probably pretty different from what they've ever experienced before. A lot of times, people in the manufacturing space have never had a cloud-based ERP. And so I'll just assume for now, I see a lot of people that are on a 20, 30, 40-year-old system. It's an on-premise solution. It's not cloud-based. So it's really changing the frame of mind and like the mindset on how to manage. They have a lot more concerns because it's all new to have a cloud-based ERP at that point. What this does is it means that they don't have to deal with servers and having to handle those and manage them. They don't have to deal with doing a virtual desktop to be able to work remotely when they're traveling. Now you are able to just access the ERP through the browser to do all your operations. And that's really valuable for these companies to start understanding and knowing that it's going to be different. Now, NetSuite does follow your normal manufacturing processes, and we'll start there. I always like to start at the very beginning at the sales order, because it all starts with sales. So
that's right.
That's probably what I'm going to start and focus on to begin with. So let me walk you through that a bit. Let's visualize for a moment what it looks like. You've got somebody that is sending you a purchase order, which means you have to enter that into your ERP as a sales order. You may accept orders in a few different ways. Maybe you have e-commerce. Maybe you have a sales rep manually taking the orders over a phone or email. Maybe you receive it via an email as a purchase order, or maybe you have large big box retailers that need to be able to send it to you via EDI. And all of these are options, and you can do anything, but I'm just calling those out. Yes, those are all covered, and all something we help scope during the implementation. A lot of times manufacturers will have EDI. We'll bring in an EDI provider, ask if they have someone already so we can tie it together and connect it with NetSuite. That's a great way to handle large batches of orders that are coming through consistently. And many times, some of these big box retailers will require that you connect via EDI because that's all that they'll do. And being able to have open APIs, cloud-based REST APIs, be able to access it, that's really valuable, and then via EDI too. So
Caleb,
that is one method of getting the sales order in.
Caleb, on that point of EDIs, how challenging is it to really start setting up systems according to that for the first time? So if I'm a manufacturing company and I have this opportunity for the first time working with one of these big box stores and they want to connect through EDI, like how challenging is that from a practical perspective to get that set up?
It's not super challenging. I like to set maybe a 6-week timeline from the beginning, getting it configured. There's multiple rounds of testing to go through before, and then production deployment, meaning that assuming you're already live on an ERP like NetSuite, we would first build it all in a sandbox environment and then test it and deploy it so that it's all working as expected and not going to impact any of your operations by testing in sandbox first. So I like to give myself, call it a 6-week timeline, but it's pretty straightforward to set up and relatively affordable. Certainly more affordable than manually entering in having sales reps manually enter in each sales order. So, and paying those people's salary. Certainly more affordable than that.
That's right. Good to know.
So hopefully that gives some context. So let's say now we've got the sales order in the system through a number of ways. At that stage, maybe there's a deposit. You may have a customer deposit that you apply to that sales order. Maybe it's a prepaid with a credit card. If you're selling like small batches and make to order of the product, you might sell just an individual quantity. And in those scenarios, you're going to be doing batch builds and stocking it as inventory. But you could technically have a cash sale, which would indicate that you've already collected the money to impact your accounting. From there, if you have customers on terms, then you skip the customer deposit, the cash sale. Those would be already handled, will be handled later, I guess, on the invoicing stage. And normally you're going to go into the fulfillment. It's called the item fulfillment record in NetSuite, which means that this is where you would actually perform the shipment. Now, if you're in a manufacturing organization and you don't have inventory available, it considers already committed inventory. So if you have already committed quantities on other orders, then you have to go into the initiate the purchase or to initiate the work order process. This is the next step with a work orders and assembly module, part of the manufacturing edition inside of NetSuite. Is what you'll do is you'll then generate the work order so that you can go do the assembly. And when you complete the assembly build process, which contains the bill of materials, you can go through that process. You can have work in progress, that whip and routing as part of this process too. And at that stage, it is now, when the build is completed, you are now consuming the individual components and then creating that finished good, that final assembly. So what's happening within NetSuite, and it's impacting accounting right away too, is it's deducting that inventory from that raw material and increasing the inventory of the finished good. And from there, then you have the finished good that is available to actually perform the shipment and finish the item fulfillment. So that's really the key process to go through, up through that manufacturing process, and then get to the fulfillment stage. So now we're at fulfillment, right? And at this stage, you've got all your inventory available to be able to add to the fulfillment and ship the product out. You can do an integration with FedEx, USPS, UPS. Typically, the native integration is going to be mostly stronger at the parcel level. There's some other pallet build functionality on Ship Central, which is available within NetSuite. But if you want to do freight or LTL, there's a number of apps that install that integrate to do rate shopping there. I also have clients that just manually go into FedEx or something like that, put in the from address, ship to address, the weight, all those dimensions, and they'll manually override the shipping price on the item fulfillment. It gets shipped. What that means is that once that inventory has left your warehouse, it impacts accounting right away. And item fulfillment is GL impacting because at that stage, the inventory, the finished goods that you've created, is no longer on your books. It actually belongs to the customer at that moment of shipment. And that all happens live, all at the same time. And this is why an ERP is so important, because automatically accounting is getting their information impacted and updated. The warehouse and the fulfillment is. You've also got the sales team on that CRM and the sales order. You got the manufacturing. Everybody is connected, and automatically these processes are completing them. You don't need to go integrate them 100 different times okay, that's hyperbole a little, but you don't have to integrate a ton of a warehouse solution. You don't have to go and integrate a manufacturing solution, a CRM, order management, and accounting. A lot of times without an ERP, you're integrating to all these different systems, and they're just not talking to each other like NetSuite does. And that's really the main process is.
Yeah, and I agree, Caleb. I think what you're saying and explaining how everything's essentially already integrated is very important. That's where companies can really maximize their return on investment because it's not going to be so clunky to manage. The management is truly going to be streamlined. Now, one question I have for you, Caleb, is, as you just spoke about that process, anytime a company undergoes implementation of a process like that, there are certain elements to that that usually you need to pay special attention to, because if you don't, things can get a little out of hand or might not be fully set up the right way, and it might take, you might have to iron out some kinks down the road. So based on the process you just described, where do you think is the one area that people need to pay special attention to, just to make sure they really keep a pulse on that part of the implementation to make sure they get that part right? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, in the manufacturing industry is particularly important because there's usually people that aren't very technical in that space. They only have a handful of people who are tech savvy. Because they've been on a system from 30 years ago, no one really knows how to use typical software. There's some people that just struggle with Outlook in that industry, which is okay. It's just where they're at. And there's some, and you'll have a couple people probably who will be very tech savvy and be able to be your subject matter experts, and that's great. You'll need those. But the most experienced people will say that the most important thing is on change management. The most inexperienced people will pay no attention to change management, especially in the manufacturing space. So if you are coming to an implementation thinking that, nope, change management will be easy, you should question that. Ask yourself, really inquire why you believe that, because when it comes to an ERP environment for manufacturing, historically always is one of the hardest to implement, not because the software processes are hard to set up and configure NetSuite. It's the training and things clicking. People don't take, I've observed that a lot of clients in that space don't take as much initiative, don't have people that are taking the initiative and really need a lot more hand-holding. And that can slow the process down. And it's just they have a further gap on their technical abilities within understanding business processes and how they relate to software. And that is the gap, the delta, that slows down projects and makes them harder. So that's why I like to focus on it, is training, but also assessing their ability, even on the sales evaluation. I like to have a conversation and gauge, but like I can tell whether a client's team is tech savvy or not. And if a client is only have like one or two people on the evaluation, I can't gauge the ability of their team members. And it's important during an evaluation that I get a sense of their abilities on the call, witness it myself, and I can speak to it more directly for maybe it's the CFO or the CEO, president, whatever that may be, leading the charge. If they're not bringing in key stakeholders across all departments, I can't gauge risk in order for me to be able to guide them on like, hey, going to need a little bit more change management time here. That's probably something that I've seen happen, is where we don't have the key stakeholders in those departments throughout the demonstrations, throughout the evaluation, and it really can impact the implementation.
Yeah. Getting as much buy-in as possible from the internal team, as you're saying, Caleb, can be a critical step in managing that change
buy-in
management.
is one factor. There's really a couple factors. There's buy-in so that people are excited for the change, which helps them be motivated to make the change. But there's the other part is whether they even have the abilities in the first place, even if they have the right attitude. You can have the right attitude and the ability to be someone who's excited for change, but the person who's excited to change and can work through the challenges of change, the frustrations of change with a positive attitude and have the technical ability to actually be able to do it, that's that secret sauce, all those factors together.
Yeah, I could see how that's important. Now, so at this point, we've gone through the order process. You spoke a little bit about the manufacturing process, but what we didn't really touch on, what I'm curious about, is once the products are actually manufactured, how about the warehouse portion of this? So the merchant, right, has a warehouse they store products in. What does that look like in NetSuite? How native is that when a merchant signs up for NetSuite? Can you kind of talk to us about that?
I lightly touched on it with the item fulfillment process, but I didn't go into any depth there at all. There's a couple different phases or ways that we'll evaluate what you actually need. within that manufacturing edition, there's going to be advanced inventory management, which has everything like reorder points that impact your demand planning. It also has serialized and lot functionality for traceability of the item to the customer if you're in a space that requires that traceability. And it also is going to have things like the pick, pack, ship processes throughout the fulfillment. You can have different stages there. And it has the ability to have bins and locations, and you can do inventory transfers between these. There's some scanning functionality. Then there's one more layer beyond that called NetSuite WMS. And there's other third-party WMS solutions that integrate with NetSuite today, too. But NetSuite WMS is just available, a product by NetSuite. It's an add-on on top of the primary SKU, or the primary edition that would be purchased. And that's going to be full warehouse functionality. This would get into more in-depth wave picking, put-away strategies, your more in-depth cycle counting, and all of that is like kind of that core functionality, more functionality when it comes to scanning on receipt as well as shipment, and that whole process is where that's going to come into play, because then you're going to unlock more scanning functionality for higher volumes. But that is not always needed, depending on the volume. Let's say you're doing more freight and LTL, and you're a manufacturing company with higher ticket items, maybe not doing massive volume. Maybe like, I don't know, if you're sub 30 million in annual revenue as a manufacturing company, you often don't need WMS. You can just use the pick, pack, ship processes and handle those. And I'm also assuming that these are, maybe you're shipping by the pallet or larger quantities at a time, so that the total order value is higher. If you're doing like $50, if you're a manufacturing company that sells a product as well, and it's like $50 orders, that's going to be higher volume. That changes my opinion. Then you're going to need a WMS, right?
Yeah. So Caleb,
most of the time that's the differences.
So you would say that it really comes down to volume, whether or not you're going to need that WMS right off the bat, right?
Yeah, that's a key factor.
Yeah. Now, if, say, for example, a company doesn't get the WMS right off the bat, how easy is it to grow into that down the line? Say you're a year or two in, is that a module that you can grow into easily? Or is there going to have to be a lot of tech debt, a lot of time reworking stuff you've already set up?
No, it sits on top of the inventory management processes, and that item fulfillment record is a core record. It's a very important transaction record for any type of inventory management. So that all remains the same, and so that WMS sits on top of all those existing processes. So it's adding additional functionality. You don't have to rework it. And that's kind of the nice thing about it, is that it's easy to add in later. Wherever I find opportunity in the evaluation, and when I ask a prospective client, I try to tell them, hey, let me challenge you, and like what your inclinations are. Let me challenge you a little bit just to help think a little bigger. A lot of times people want to get everything, and I really try and challenge them to try and phase it out. Helps with change management. Also helps phase out the cost, because you can't implement everything on day one.
That's right.
You can go live day one with everything, but your implementation timeline is impacted. And value to get on a new system, go live, and make improvements from there and add things on. Phasing is an important step.
That's right. That's a great call out. So WMS sits on top of the standard NetSuite instance, but also I know we haven't gotten into this yet, but e-commerce. I know NetSuite has SuiteCommerce, an e-commerce platform that you can stack on top of NetSuite. It sounds like kind of in a similar way to WMS, but can you talk to us, Caleb, from your experience? What does SuiteCommerce, what does the e-commerce portion of NetSuite look like for manufacturing companies today?
Well, manufacturing is going to be B2B e-commerce normally. So you're going to have, if you have SuiteCommerce and want to implement that, that's a good solution, because there's no transaction fees. It's just straight licensing. So if you're selling a $5,000 order, it's just straight licensing fees. They're not paying transaction fees. So it can make a nice difference there. SuiteCommerce really focuses on the B2B, on those B2B only businesses. I think it's the strongest there. Now, some of these manufacturing companies have a component of B2C or really want to expand into it as their overall strategy. And SuiteCommerce can do B2C, that direct-to-consumer functionality, even on the same domain. And that's when I start thinking, oh, well, after about, if you start having more than 10% direct to consumer, I like to start introducing BigCommerce as a really good way to phase into that B2B space for manufacturing. Sometimes I'll lead with BigCommerce, and because I think that between BigCommerce and SuiteCommerce, those are going to be the best e-commerce solutions for manufacturing companies. And after vetting a lot of them, I've reconfirmed that over and over again that I found that those are the best. And there's pros and cons between each one too.
Yeah. And just to add a little bit more color to the BigCommerce side of things, right? With BigCommerce, it truly is an external e-commerce hosting platform that is not built on top of NetSuite. So in order to make that work, right, you're going to need an integration or a connection between the two. And that's one of the major things that, Caleb, I know you and I see that separates the two is that, you know, an integration layer, there's an added expense there and time needed to set that up. Now, granted, sometimes BigCommerce truly is the better play for a manufacturing company, but sometimes, right, SuiteCommerce isn't in that case. You're pulling right from that NetSuite data. You don't need an integration because SuiteCommerce is sitting right on top of the NetSuite environment.
Yeah, and sometimes people just are trying to figure out which one's best all by themselves with their own research. And I'm like, I could have a 30-minute conversation and tell you very quickly which one's going to be best for you and why. And answer all your questions in just a rapid fire Q&A that I can help guide people in the right direction there. I think people spend a lot of time doing research and are afraid to talk to people. And I just encourage people to talk to people who know multiple solutions to help guide you through them and the pros and cons of each, because I've seen people spend hours and hours trying to research without having really anybody that can give them some agnostic view between the differences between both of these solutions. I really enjoy doing that. That's something, just providing good advice throughout an evaluation and my thought process and reasoning why and put myself in their shoes is probably my favorite thing to do.
Yeah, and that's important. I also have seen people research for hours and hours, and within, 15 or 30-minute conversation, they can get some good direction, just based on our experience.
Yeah, sometimes people are just scared to talk to someone, or they're just worried to have the conversation and be bugged, and I get it. I'm pretty respectful of that, where I always ask, like, hey, what's a good next step for you? What's a good time for me to follow up that doesn't seem annoying?
Yeah.
Because that's the worst. I think people just get scared to have a conversation. But
yeah,
that's okay.
Probably because scars from the past, there's probably been other people that have just not left their email inbox for the next year, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, honestly, we've covered most of what manufacturing and NetSuite is. We didn't really talk on the accounting side that much, but we talked about the core process areas, at least that order to cash process, WIP and routing, work orders and assembly. We didn't cover a lot. We didn't really cover procure to pay that much, but that's okay. We can cover more of that purchase order and vendor payment process in a later podcast. And I think that NetSuite's just a great solution for companies that have that level of manufacturing. There's some companies that have really advanced manufacturing beyond work orders, assemblies, WIP and routing. That's when we need to introduce a couple like apps to install. But those, for what I just described there, like if you fit those particular process areas in manufacturing, NetSuite's a solid fit. So that's all I got to cover today. Thanks for some of the discussion here, Michael, and maybe on this next one, in the next one coming up here, we'll cover more of that procure to pay process and even some other industries too. Sweet. Yeah.